The early morning fog clung to Fort Mitchell like a damp blanket, muffling the sounds of mess hall clatter and distant drill sergeants barking orders. Staff Sergeant Eliza Morgan adjusted her chef's coat one final time and stepped through the kitchen's double doors, her recipe notebook tucked securely under her arm. 22 years of military culinary service had taught her that first impressions mattered, especially when you were the outsider walking into an established kitchen unit. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The base kitchen buzzed with the controlled chaos of breakfast preparation. Cooks moved between stations with purpose, their conversations mixing with the hiss of griddles and the mechanical hum of industrial mixers. Eliza had requested this assignment specifically, a quiet position at a mid-sized training camp where she could finish out her final years of service without drama. After everything she'd been through, she craved the mundane predictability of meal schedules and inventory management. Her new supervisor, Master Sergeant Tony Rivera, was waiting for her near the preparation tables. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of swagger that came from never having his authority seriously challenged in a kitchen. His handshake was firm but brief, his eyes already cataloging her appearance with a casual assessment of someone sizing up potential problems. "So you're our new culinary specialist," he said, not quite making it sound like a question. "Hope you're ready to jump right in. We run a tight ship here, and I don't have time to hold anyone's hand through basic procedures." Eliza nodded politely. She'd worked under dozens of kitchen supervisors over the years and could usually read them within the first 5 minutes. Rivera was the type who needed to establish dominance early, probably insecure about managing someone with more experience, nothing she hadn't handled before. "I'm ready to get started, Sergeant," she replied. "I've reviewed the meal plans. Looks like you're running an efficient operation." As they walked toward the main preparation area, Eliza noticed several cooks watching her with undisguised curiosity. She pulled out her small notebook, a battered composition book filled with handwritten recipes and notes. The cover was stained with various ingredients, the edges worn from years of use in kitchens around the world. The kitchen smelled of coffee, fresh bread, and industrial cleaning supplies, with motivational posters covering walls that hadn't seen fresh paint in years. 3 other cooks were clustered around the center island, their conversation dying as she entered. Rivera gestured toward them with the casual authority of someone introducing his territory. "Corporal Jake Wilson, Specialist Lisa Martinez, and Private First Class Danny Brooks. They'll be working with you for meal preparation and special events." He paused, letting that sink in. "With you, but through me. All menu decisions go through my desk first." Wilson, a stocky cook with prematurely gray temples, glanced at her notebook and smirked slightly. "Nice recipe collection, ma'am. Military regulation?" The question carried just enough edge to make it clear he wasn't asking out of genuine interest. Eliza met his eyes steadily. "It's within regulations, Corporal." "Just checking," Wilson replied, his tone suggesting he found her answer amusing. "We get a lot of people through here who don't quite understand how things work at a real military kitchen." Martinez shot Wilson a warning look, but Brooks was already leaning forward with the eager cruelty of someone who'd found a target. "Is that supposed to be some kind of special cookbook? Looks like something from a yard sale." Eliza had heard worse, much worse, in places where mockery was the least of her problems. She simply nodded once and turned her attention to Rivera. "When can we start the kitchen walkthrough?" But she could feel their eyes on her notebook, and she caught Wilson whispering something to Brooks that made both of them chuckle. The sound was familiar. The particular brand of casual cruelty that flourished in groups where people assumed they were dealing with someone who couldn't fight back. Rivera led her through the kitchen areas with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd given the same tour dozens of times. He pointed out storage protocols, showed her the inventory system, and explained the daily reporting requirements with the kind of detail that suggested he didn't trust her to figure out basic procedures on her own. "One thing you need to understand," he said as they stood in the main storage area, "is that this isn't some desk job. We support 3,000 troops, and when they need food, they need it fast, and they need it right. There's no margin for error." Eliza nodded, making notes in her pocket notebook. Around them, the storage area stretched out in organized rows of ingredients and supplies. Everything was labeled, cataloged, and positioned according to a system that made sense once you understood the logic behind it. "What's the typical turnaround time for special meal requests?" she asked. "Depends on what they're asking for," Rivera replied. "Standard mess, same day. Anything that requires coordination with other facilities or special authorization goes through me personally. And I mean personally. Every single request." There was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't just about maintaining order. This was about control, about making sure everyone understood that nothing happened without his explicit approval. Eliza filed that observation away for future reference. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As they completed the tour, she noticed how the other cooks interacted with Rivera. There was respect there, but it was the careful kind that came from knowing exactly where the lines were drawn and what happened to people who crossed them. Martinez kept her responses brief and professional. Brooks seemed eager to please, almost anxious about saying the wrong thing. Wilson maintained a facade of casual camaraderie, but Eliza caught the way his jaw tightened when Rivera gave him direct orders. Back in the main kitchen, Rivera handed her a thick binder filled with regulations and procedures. "Your homework for tonight," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'll expect you to be up to speed by tomorrow morning. We start breakfast prep at 04:00 sharp." Eliza tucked the binder under her arm and prepared to leave. As she reached the door, Wilson's voice stopped her. "Ma'am, about that notebook. Is it some kind of family thing? Military tradition?" She turned back to face the room. All four of them were watching her now, waiting for an explanation that would satisfy their curiosity or confirm their assumptions about her being someone who needed to prove herself to them. "It's personal, Corporal," she said quietly. "Everything's personal until it affects the unit," Rivera interjected. "If it's going to be a distraction or cause problems with kitchen standards, we need to address it now." Eliza felt the familiar weight of having to justify something that needed no justification, but she also recognized the game being played. This wasn't about regulations or unit cohesion. This was about testing boundaries, seeing how much pressure she could handle before she either pushed back or folded. "The recipes are within regulation, Sergeant," she repeated. "Is there anything else you need from me today?" Rivera studied her for a long moment, probably trying to decide whether to push the issue further or save it for another day. Finally, he shrugged. "That's all for now. Don't be late tomorrow." As Eliza walked across the base toward the temporary quarters she'd been assigned, she could feel the weight of first impressions settling around her like dust. The notebook felt heavier than usual, not because of its physical weight, but because of the attention it had drawn. She'd hoped to blend in, to find a quiet corner where she could do her job without having to explain or defend herself. But, as she'd learned over 2 decades of military service, hope was a luxury that rarely survived contact with reality. The notebook wasn't just recipes to her, and eventually someone was going to ask questions. The only question was whether that someone would be friend or foe, and whether she'd have any choice in how much of her story she'd have to reveal. The alarm clock's harsh buzz cut through Eliza's sleep at 3:15, just as it had for more years than she cared to count. She'd never needed the full snooze cycle. Military life had trained her body to wake up ready, whether she felt like it or not. Outside her temporary quarters window, the base was already stirring with the quiet efficiency of an organization that ran on schedules measured in minutes rather than hours. She dressed with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else, checking her uniform in the small mirror mounted above the standard-issue dresser. The notebook sat on her nightstand, its worn cover a silent reminder of all the kitchens she'd worked in and all the secrets it contained. The mess hall served pre-shift coffee with military efficiency, hot and strong and designed to fuel bodies that would spend the next 12 hours on their feet. Eliza chose a table near the window where she could watch the morning activity while she drank. The conversations around her were typical military chatter, complaints about the hours, discussions of weekend plans, good-natured griping about upcoming inspections. At 04:00 precisely, she pushed through the kitchen doors to find Rivera already at his station with a cup of coffee, and what looked like overnight reports spread in front of him. He glanced up with the expression of someone who'd been hoping she might oversleep and give him a reason to establish his authority more firmly. "Good," he said, making it sound like punctuality was a personal favor she was doing him. "Wilson's already started prepping breakfast meats. Martinez is handling the baking. Brooks is on eggs. That leaves you with the fun job." He gestured toward a stack of request forms. "Special dietary meals. We've got 27 today. Religious restrictions, medical requirements, allergen concerns. Some of these have been sitting here for days because nobody wants to deal with the extra work." Eliza settled at the station he assigned, a stainless steel workspace that showed every year of hard use. The special request forms were a mess. Some filled out correctly, others missing crucial information, a few that seemed to have been written by people who weren't entirely sure what they were asking for. "Any particular priority system?" she asked. "Squeaky wheel gets the grease," Rivera replied without looking up from his own work. "The units that complain the most get handled first. The ones that submit proper paperwork get handled properly. Everyone else gets handled when we feel like it." It was a system designed to create problems rather than solve them. But Eliza had seen worse. She pulled the first form from the stack and began working through the details, cross-referencing dietary restrictions and checking availability against their inventory database. The work was routine, almost meditative in its predictability. Wilson appeared at her station around 6:30 with a clipboard and an expression that suggested he had something important to share. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about your notebook situation." Eliza continued working without looking up. "What situation is that, Corporal?" "Well, I did some digging last night, and I couldn't find any record of your special recipes in any of the standard military culinary databases. Makes me wonder if it might be some kind of unauthorized modification to standard mess." The room had gone quiet. Martinez stopped kneading dough. Brooks paused in his egg preparation, and even Rivera looked up from his coffee with the interest of someone watching a potentially entertaining confrontation develop. Eliza saved her work and turned to face Wilson fully. "Are you filing a formal complaint about my recipes, Corporal?" "Just raising a question about standards," Wilson replied. But there was uncertainty in his voice now. He probably expected her to get defensive or try to explain herself, not respond with the kind of direct question that required him to either commit to his position or back down. "Then I suggest you research the relevant regulations and submit your concerns through proper channels," Eliza said calmly. "Is there anything else you need help with regarding today's meal preparation?" Wilson glanced toward Rivera, clearly hoping for backup that didn't materialize. The sergeant was watching the exchange with the detached interest of someone waiting to see how it played out before deciding which side to support. "No, ma'am," Wilson finally said, "just trying to maintain unit standards." "Understood. Thank you for your diligence." The formality in her response carried just enough edge to make it clear the conversation was over, but not enough to give anyone grounds for complaint. Wilson retreated to his own station, but Eliza could feel him watching her for the rest of the morning, probably trying to figure out why his attempt at intimidation had bounced off her like water off a duck. Around 9:30, a captain from one of the visiting training units stopped by to check on a special meal request his people had submitted. Eliza pulled his paperwork and discovered it had been sitting in the pile for almost 3 weeks, without anyone bothering to process it. "Let me handle this personally," she told him. "I should have an answer for you within the hour." It took 45 minutes of ingredient checks and preparation planning to work out a meal plan that would accommodate his unit's needs. Some items were available locally, others could be prepared with slight modifications, and a few required special handling that she was able to expedite through channels she remembered from previous assignments. When she handed the captain his completed forms, his relief was obvious. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant. I was starting to think we'd have to modify our entire training schedule around meal availability." "Just doing my job, sir." But Rivera had been listening to her conversation, and his expression suggested he wasn't entirely pleased with her efficiency. After the captain left, he appeared at her station with his arms folded. "In the future, I'd appreciate being consulted before you start making promises about special meal preparation," he said. "We have procedures for a reason." "Of course, Sergeant. I assumed time-sensitive requests took priority over administrative process. Everything goes through me first. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, Sergeant." The confrontation was brief and professional, but everyone in the kitchen had witnessed it. Martinez gave Eliza a subtle nod of support when Rivera wasn't looking, while Brooks seemed disappointed that the conflict had resolved without more drama. Wilson just watched with the calculating expression of someone filing away information for future use. Lunch service came and went without incident, but the afternoon brought a new wrinkle. A master sergeant from the Base Inspection Command stopped by to review their quarterly reports, and his questions revealed some discrepancies in ingredient tracking that went back several months. Missing signatures, items logged as used but not accounted for in meal counts, requisition forms that had been approved but never processed. Eliza found herself pulled into the discussion, partly because she was the newest member of the team, and partly because her questions about the existing systems had touched on some of the same issues the inspector was raising. She answered carefully, sticking to what she could verify from the records, rather than speculating about problems she'd only begun to identify. But when the inspector left, Rivera was clearly agitated. "I hope you don't think you're going to come in here and start pointing fingers at how we've been doing business," he said. "I'm just trying to understand the system, Sergeant. If there are process improvements that could help us avoid future problems." "The systems work fine when people follow them correctly," Rivera interrupted. "Maybe instead of worrying about notebooks and impressing visiting officers, you should focus on learning how things actually work around here." The comment about the notebook was deliberate, designed to remind everyone in the room about their earlier conversations and keep the focus on her as an outsider who didn't understand local customs. Eliza recognized the tactic: deflect attention from systemic problems by making the discussion personal. "Understood, Sergeant. Is there anything specific you'd like me to prioritize?" "I want you to double-check all the inventory reports from the past month. Make sure everything that's supposed to be here is actually here, and everything that's logged as used has the proper paperwork." It was busy work designed to keep her occupied with details while the real decisions got made without her input. But Eliza had played these games before, and she understood that sometimes the best response was patience rather than resistance. As the day ended and the kitchen began to empty, Martinez lingered by Eliza's station. "Don't take it personally," she said quietly. "He does this with everyone new. Tests boundaries, sees how much pressure people can handle." "Appreciate the heads up," Eliza replied. "That notebook," Martinez continued, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "It's not standard military recipes, is it?" Eliza looked up from her paperwork. Martinez's question carried genuine curiosity rather than the challenging tone Wilson had used earlier. "No, it's not." "Didn't think so. I've never seen anything like it." Martinez paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "Look, I don't know what your story is, and it's none of my business. But around here, anything that makes you stand out becomes a target. Just something to keep in mind." It was good advice delivered by someone who clearly understood the social dynamics of their workplace. Eliza appreciated both the warning and the way it had been offered without judgment or demands for explanation. "Thanks, Lisa. I'll keep that in mind." As she walked back to her quarters that evening, Eliza reflected on her first full day. The work itself was routine, well within her capabilities. The interpersonal dynamics were more complicated, but not unprecedented. She'd worked in hostile environments before, places where her competence was questioned and her presence resented. The difference was that in those other places, the stakes had been life and death. Here, the worst that could happen was administrative inconvenience and professional friction. She could handle that. The question was whether she wanted to, and whether the peaceful assignment she'd been hoping for was worth the energy it would take to establish her place in this particular hierarchy. The notebook sat on her small desk, its pages filled with formulas and measurements that looked like recipes to anyone who didn't know better. For a moment, she considered Martinez's advice about standing out. But hiding the notebook felt like surrender, and surrender had never been her style. Whatever came next, she'd face it as herself, with all the complications that entailed. The third week at Fort Mitchell brought the kind of autumn weather that made morning formations feel like punishment. Cold enough to make you wish for better gear, but not quite cold enough to justify breaking out the winter uniforms. Eliza arrived at the kitchen to find an unusual level of activity for 05:00 in the morning. Brooks was hauling equipment from storage. Martinez was on the phone with someone who seemed to require a lot of patient explanation, and Wilson was standing over a spread of inventory sheets with the concentrated expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle he didn't entirely understand. Rivera looked up from his desk with the kind of smile that immediately put her on guard. "Perfect timing, Morgan. We've got a situation that's right in your wheelhouse." He gestured toward a stack of paperwork that looked significantly more official than their usual requisition forms. "Emergency meal request from Colonel Marcus Thornhill's office. They're running a joint training exercise next week with some NATO liaison officers, and apparently someone screwed up the original catering order. They need full meal service for 40 personnel, including specialized dietary requirements and field-ready combat rations." Eliza scanned the requirements list, noting the tight timeline and specific standards. It was the kind of request that required careful coordination and couldn't afford mistakes. "When do they need delivery?" "Day after tomorrow." "Oh, and here's the fun part. Half of these ingredients aren't in our standard inventory. You're going to have to source them from other facilities and coordinate transportation." Wilson looked up from his inventory sheets. "Shouldn't be too hard for someone with culinary experience," he said, his tone managing to make it sound like he had serious doubts about her culinary experience. Eliza studied the paperwork more carefully, cross-referencing requirements against their available stock. The request was complex, but not impossible, assuming everything went smoothly with interbase coordination and assuming no one made any critical errors in the process. "I'll need access to the priority communications channels for facility coordination," she said. "Already arranged," Rivera replied. "You've got full authority to make whatever calls you need to make. Consider this your chance to show us what real culinary coordination looks like." There was something in his tone that made her cautious. This felt less like an opportunity and more like a test, the kind where the parameters were designed to create problems rather than solve them. But she'd requested this assignment specifically because she wanted to do actual culinary work, and complaining about getting exactly what she'd asked for would send the wrong message. She spent the morning mapping out sourcing strategies and making initial contact calls to other bases. Some of the required ingredients were available locally, but the specialized dietary components would have to come from a facility 2 states away, and the field rations required specific preparation protocols that limited her options. By noon, she'd identified suppliers for everything on the list and had preliminary commitments for delivery schedules that would meet the colonel's timeline. The coordination was complex, requiring careful timing and backup plans for potential transportation delays, but it was exactly the kind of problem-solving that had drawn her to military culinary work in the first place. Wilson appeared at her station during lunch with a concerned expression. "Ma'am, I've been looking at some of those dietary requirements, and I think there might be a problem." He spread out a nutritional specification sheet that detailed caloric requirements and allergen protocols for the requested meals. "According to this, the ingredients you're sourcing from Fort Leavenworth won't meet the halal requirements here. Different processing standards, different certification types." Eliza studied the specifications carefully. Wilson was right about the technical details, but there was something in his presentation that felt rehearsed, like he'd been waiting for the right moment to reveal information he'd been holding back. "When did you identify this compatibility issue?" she asked. "Just now when I was double-checking the nutrition specs. These specification sheets were available yesterday when we started planning. Did anyone review them at that time?" Wilson glanced toward Rivera's desk, but the sergeant was conveniently involved in a phone conversation that kept him from participating in their discussion. "I guess it got overlooked in the rush to get everything organized," Wilson said. Eliza felt the familiar sensation of recognizing a setup in progress. The dietary incompatibility was real, but the timing of its discovery was suspicious. Someone had known about this problem from the beginning and had chosen to let her proceed with planning that was doomed to fail. "Thank you for catching this, Corporal," she said evenly. "I'll adjust the sourcing plan accordingly." The adjustment required canceling her arrangements with Fort Leavenworth and finding alternative suppliers for ingredients that were now in much shorter supply. 3 phone calls and 2 hours of negotiation later, she'd managed to locate compatible ingredients at a facility in Georgia, but the delivery schedule would be tight and the cost would be significantly higher. Rivera finished his phone call and wandered over to check on her progress. "Everything's still on track? We had a compatibility issue with the dietary requirements, but I found alternative sources. Delivery will still meet the timeline, but cost will be about 30% higher than originally estimated." 30%? Rivera raised his eyebrows in theatrical concern. "That's a significant budget impact. Are you sure there isn't a more cost-effective solution?" Eliza recognized the position she was being placed in: accept the higher costs and take responsibility for a budget overrun, or compromise on standards and risk delivering meals that wouldn't meet the Colonel's requirements. I can continue searching for alternatives, but that might impact our delivery timeline, she said. What's the priority, budget or schedule? Both, Rivera replied with a shrug. That's what makes it challenging. Brooks had been listening to their conversation while pretending to organize supplies. Maybe the problem is trying to do too much too fast, he suggested. The implication was clear. The problems they were facing resulted from poor planning on Eliza's part, not from deliberate sabotage or unrealistic expectations. She could feel the dynamic in the room shifting as the narrative took shape. The new person had promised to handle a complex request but was now struggling with basic coordination. I'll find a solution, Eliza said simply. The rest of the afternoon was spent on the phone with suppliers, transportation coordinators, and dietary specialists. She managed to identify a source for compatible ingredients at costs that split the difference between her original estimates and the inflated Georgia prices. But it required calling in favors with people she'd worked with at previous assignments and agreeing to expedited shipping that left no margin for error. By closing time, she had confirmation on all required ingredients with delivery schedules that would meet Colonel Thornhill's requirements and costs that stayed within reasonable budget parameters. It had required 12 hours of intensive coordination and had consumed most of her goodwill with suppliers at 3 different facilities. But the job was done. Rivera reviewed her final coordination plan with the expression of someone who'd been hoping for a different outcome. This looks workable, he admitted, assuming nothing goes wrong with any of the deliveries. There are backup plans for the critical items, Eliza replied. If the primary shipments are delayed, we can source locally and upgrade to specifications at delivery. Good thinking. His tone suggested he wasn't entirely pleased with her good thinking. As the kitchen cleared out for the evening, Martinez stopped by Eliza's station. That was impressive, she said quietly. Most people would have thrown up their hands when that compatibility issue surfaced. Just doing the job, Eliza replied. Right, except the job wasn't supposed to be doable. Martinez glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard. That dietary restriction problem didn't just get discovered today. Wilson's been aware of it since the request came in. I saw him reviewing those nutrition specs on Tuesday. Eliza wasn't surprised by the confirmation, but hearing it stated directly was different from suspecting it. Why are you telling me this? Because what happened today wasn't about testing your culinary skills. It was about setting you up to fail, and then blaming the failure on your inexperience or incompetence. Martinez paused. I don't know why, and I don't know what they have against you personally, but you should know that this isn't normal hazing or professional development. This is something else. The conversation stayed with Eliza as she walked back to her quarters. She'd suspected from the beginning that the assignment was designed to create problems. But having that suspicion confirmed changed the stakes. This wasn't just about proving her competence or establishing her place in the kitchen hierarchy. This was about people actively working to undermine her success. The notebook felt heavier as she prepared for bed, weighted not just with its own significance, but with the growing realization that her quiet assignment was turning into something more complicated. Tomorrow would bring the actual ingredient deliveries, and she had no illusions about what would happen if anything went wrong. But she'd handled worse situations, with higher stakes and fewer resources. Whatever game was being played here, she was prepared to see it through to the end. The only question was what the end would look like, and whether she'd be the one left standing when the dust settled. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that made everything look sharper, including the tension in the kitchen. Eliza arrived early to coordinate the incoming ingredient deliveries, only to find Rivera already at his station with a cup of coffee and an expression that suggested he hadn't slept particularly well. Status report, he said without preamble. First delivery truck arrives at 0900 with the specialized ingredients from Georgia. Second truck at 11:30 with the field rations from Fort Benning. Local pickup for miscellaneous items starts at 1400. Everything's on schedule for completion by 1600, 2 hours ahead of the Colonel's deadline. Outstanding, Rivera replied, but his tone suggested he found the news less than outstanding. I'll be in meetings most of the day. so you'll be handling the coordination independently. Try not to let anything slip through the cracks. Wilson and Brooks arrived together, their conversation cutting off abruptly when they noticed Eliza at her station. There was something in their demeanor that reminded her of students who'd spent the night before an exam, plotting ways to ensure their classmate failed. "Big day," Wilson observed. "A lot of moving parts, a lot of opportunities for things to go wrong." "That's why we plan for contingencies," Eliza replied. "Right, but you can't plan for everything. Sometimes ingredients show up spoiled. Sometimes drivers get lost. Sometimes the paperwork doesn't match what actually gets delivered." Wilson's tone was conversational, but there was an undercurrent of anticipation that made his comments feel more like predictions than concerns. The first delivery truck arrived precisely on schedule, which should have been good news. The driver was professional. The manifest matched Eliza's orders, and the ingredients appeared to be in perfect condition. But when she opened the boxes for inspection, she discovered that while the ingredient labels were correct, the certification documentation showed religious dietary guidelines that wouldn't interface with their preparation protocols. It was a subtle problem, the kind that wouldn't be discovered until someone actually tried to serve the food to personnel with specific religious requirements. The ingredients were perfect, the paperwork was perfect, but the certification was impossible. Eliza spent 20 minutes on the phone with the supplier, working through technical specifications and trying to understand how the certification mismatch had occurred. The conversation was frustrating but informative. Apparently, the ingredients had been specially certified for a different facility and had never been reset to standard parameters. "We can recertify the shipment remotely," the supplier's support representative offered. "It'll take about 3 hours and require coordination with your base chaplain's office." 3 hours would put them past the delivery deadline, and coordinating with the chaplain's office would require explanations about why the ingredients needed emergency recertification. Eliza could handle the technical aspects, but the political implications were more complicated. Wilson appeared at her station just as she was finishing the phone call. "Problems with the delivery?" "Certification issue. It's being resolved." "Certification?" Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "That's the kind of thing that should have been caught during the initial specifications review, isn't it?" The comment was delivered with perfect innocence, but Eliza understood its implications. Someone reviewing the conversation later would note that proper planning should have identified potential certification problems before ingredients were ordered and shipped. "These certifications are typically handled automatically during the fulfillment process," Eliza replied. "Supplier's team is correcting the issue now. Good thing you caught it before delivery to the colonel's people. That could have been embarrassing." The second delivery arrived on schedule but with its own set of problems. The field rations were the correct type and met all the specified requirements. But 12 of the 40 units showed signs of moisture damage that suggested they'd been stored improperly and might not be safe for consumption. The damage wasn't severe enough to compromise all contents, but it was visible enough that anyone conducting a detailed inspection would notice. Eliza documented the issues and contacted the supplier, who confirmed that the rations had indeed been stored in suboptimal conditions rather than in climate-controlled facilities. According to their records, her original order had specified serviceable condition rather than perfect condition, which technically met the contract requirements, but didn't match her understanding of what had been requested. "I can arrange replacement units," the supplier offered, "but delivery would be Monday at the earliest." Monday was 3 days past the colonel's deadline, which made replacement impossible. Eliza accepted the damaged units and made detailed notes about their condition, but she knew that explaining why some of the rations showed previous damage would require careful documentation. Brooks had been observing the ration inspection with obvious interest. "Think the colonel's people will notice the moisture damage?" he asked. "Everything will be documented in the delivery report," Eliza replied. "Sure, but will they read the delivery report before they start eating the food? Sometimes people just assume that if it comes from the mess hall, it must be perfect." The afternoon brought the local pickups, which should have been the easiest part of the coordination. Eliza had arranged to collect miscellaneous items from 3 different locations on base, all standard ingredients that were readily available and frequently used. But the first stop revealed that half of the requested items had been transferred to another facility the previous day without updating their inventory system. The transfer had been authorized through proper channels and was completely legitimate, but it hadn't been communicated to anyone handling current requisitions. Eliza found herself scrambling to locate alternative sources for ingredients that should have been simple to obtain. By 1500, she had managed to source everything on the colonel's requirements list, but the process had required compromises on every major item. The special dietary ingredients would work, but required recertification. The field rations were functional, but showed previous damage. The miscellaneous items came from multiple sources, with varying quality reports. Rivera returned from his meetings just as she was completing the final paperwork. "How did we make out?" "Everything on the requirements list will be delivered by 1600 as scheduled," Eliza reported. "There were some complications, but they've all been resolved." "Complications?" Eliza provided a brief summary of the issues she'd encountered and the solutions she'd implemented. Rivera listened with the expression of someone who was hearing exactly what he'd expected to hear, but not necessarily what he'd hoped to hear. "So, we're delivering questionable ingredients that require special certification and came from multiple sources instead of coordinated procurement," he summarized. "That's not exactly the seamless culinary coordination we promised the colonel's office. It meets all specified requirements and will be fully functional for the training exercise," Eliza replied. "The delivery report will document any condition issues and certification requirements." "I'm sure it will." Rivera picked up the phone. "Colonel Thornhill's office? This is Master Sergeant Rivera at Base Kitchen. I wanted to give you a heads up about your meal delivery this afternoon." Eliza couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but she could see Rivera's expression as he explained the various complications and compromises that had been necessary to meet the delivery timeline. His tone was professional and apologetic, the voice of someone doing their best to manage a difficult situation that had been created by factors beyond their control. When he hung up, his expression was grave. "The colonel wants to review the meal supplies personally before accepting delivery. He'll be here at 1700. With the ingredients staged for delivery and the paperwork completed, Colonel Marcus Thornhill's personal inspection would determine whether the past 3 days of intensive coordination had been successful, or whether Eliza's first major assignment would be recorded as a failure due to inadequate planning and execution. Wilson was practically bouncing with anticipation. "Personal inspection by a colonel," he mused. "That's not something you see every day. Hope everything meets his standards." Eliza spent the remaining hour organizing the ingredients for optimal presentation and preparing to explain the circumstances that had led to each compromise. She had documentation for everything, justification for every decision, and backup plans for potential problems. But as she watched the clock move towards 1700, she couldn't shake the feeling that the inspection would reveal problems she hadn't anticipated, problems that would make all her careful planning and documentation irrelevant. The sound of a vehicle pulling up outside the kitchen announced the colonel's arrival, and Eliza knew that the next hour would determine whether her assignment at Fort Mitchell continued, or whether she'd be looking for a new duty station much sooner than expected. Colonel Marcus Thornhill stepped through the kitchen door with the kind of presence that made everyone in the room instinctively straighten their posture. He was a tall man in his early 50s, with gray threading through his dark hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent making decisions under pressure. His uniform was immaculate, and he moved with the economical grace of someone who'd learned to waste neither time nor energy on unnecessary gestures. Rivera was on his feet immediately, snapping to attention with the kind of precision that suggested he'd been practicing. "Good evening, sir. Master Sergeant Rivera, Base Culinary Operations." "At ease, Sergeant." Thornhill's voice carried the easy authority of someone who didn't need to raise it to command attention. His eyes swept the kitchen, taking in the assembled personnel before settling on the ingredients staged near the loading dock. "I understand we've had some interesting developments with my meal request." "Yes, sir. Staff Sergeant Morgan has been coordinating the sourcing and delivery. She can brief you on the details." Eliza stepped forward, acutely aware that Wilson, Brooks, and Martinez were watching from their positions around the kitchen. This was the moment they'd all been building toward, the test that would determine whether her careful work over the past 3 days would be recognized as professional problem-solving or dismissed as inadequate execution. "Sir, all ingredients on your requirements list have been sourced and are ready for delivery," she began. "There were some procurement challenges that required alternative sourcing, but everything meets your operational specifications." Thornhill nodded and walked toward the ingredient staging area. "Show me what we're working with." Eliza led Colonel Thornhill through the special dietary ingredients first, explaining the certification issues and the remote verification that had been necessary to ensure compliance with religious requirements. She kept her explanation technical but accessible, focusing on solutions rather than problems. The certification was completed this afternoon and verified with base chaplain services. All items are fully compliant and ready for preparation according to specified guidelines. Thornhill picked up one of the certification documents, examining it with the familiarity of someone who'd handled similar paperwork in operational environments. He reviewed several pages, nodding approvingly at the detailed verification process. "This is exactly what we need," he said. "Sometimes non-standard certifications work better than generic ones anyway." Eliza felt a small surge of relief, but she knew the field rations would be a harder sell. She led Thornhill to the next staging area and addressed the condition issues directly. The field rations meet all safety and functional requirements, but 12 of the 40 units show signs of moisture exposure. The supplier classified them as serviceable rather than perfect condition, which technically met our procurement specifications but may not have matched your expectations. She handed him the detailed condition report she'd prepared, highlighting which units showed damage and what kind of inspection had been conducted to verify their operational readiness. Thornhill examined several of the rations, checking seals, packaging integrity, and content lists with the thoroughness of someone who understood that food safety in the field could have serious consequences. His inspection was more detailed than Eliza had expected, and she found herself impressed by his technical knowledge. "Serviceable rations can actually be more reliable than untested ones," he said finally. "They've been through environmental exposure, and any manufacturing defects have already been identified and documented. As long as the inspection standards are adequate, I prefer them." The miscellaneous ingredient review went smoothly, partly because Eliza had managed to source everything from reputable suppliers, and partly because Thornhill seemed more interested in functionality than cosmetic perfection. He asked detailed questions about procurement timelines, supplier reliability, and backup planning that demonstrated both technical expertise and strategic thinking. When they'd completed the ingredient review, Thornhill turned back to Eliza with an expression that had shifted from professional assessment to something more personal. "Staff Sergeant, how long have you been in culinary service?" 22 years, sir." "And before this assignment?" Eliza hesitated for a fraction of a second, aware that Rivera, Wilson, and the others were listening carefully. "Various postings, sir. Most recently, overseas deployment." "Overseas deployment." Thornhill repeated the phrase thoughtfully, his eyes dropping briefly to the notebook tucked in her pocket before returning to her face. "What kind of culinary work were you doing overseas?" The question was casual enough, but there was something in his tone that suggested more than routine curiosity. Eliza felt the familiar tension that came when conversations moved towards subjects she preferred not to discuss in detail. "Supply chain coordination, sir. Food preparation in complex operational environments." It was an accurate description that revealed nothing specific about where she'd been or what she'd been doing. But as she spoke, she noticed Thornhill's attention focusing more intently on her notebook, his expression shifting from professional interest to something that looked almost like recognition. "That's an interesting recipe collection," he said, his voice quieter now. "Family significance?" Eliza felt the familiar weight of having to explain something that couldn't be explained, not without revealing information that was supposed to remain classified. "It has personal meaning, sir." "I'm sure it does." Thornhill stepped closer, close enough that he could see the notebook more clearly. For several long seconds, the kitchen was completely silent. Everyone was watching Thornhill study the notebook with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to casual curiosity about recipes. Eliza could feel her heart rate increasing, not from fear, but from the recognition that something significant was happening. When Thornhill finally looked up, his expression had changed completely. The professional courtesy was still there, but underneath it was something that looked like surprise, mixed with respect and perhaps a touch of awe. "Staff Sergeant," he said carefully, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" It wasn't really a request, and Eliza understood that the conversation that was about to happen would determine not just the success of her ingredient delivery, but potentially the entire trajectory of her assignment at Fort Mitchell. "Of course, sir." Thornhill glanced around the kitchen at the assembled personnel. "Sergeant Rivera, please have your people finish the ingredient loading." The delivery is approved as coordinated. The dismissal was polite, but absolute, and within minutes the kitchen had cleared except for Eliza and the Colonel. When the door closed behind the last departing cook, Thornhill turned back to her with an expression that was completely different from the one he'd worn during the ingredient review. "Operation Crucible," he said quietly. "Mosul sector, 2018 through 2020. The words hit Eliza like a physical blow, not because they were threatening, but because they represented something she thought was buried so deeply that it would never surface again. Operation Crucible had been classified so far beyond normal military secrecy that officially it had never existed. "Sir, I'm not sure what you're referring to." "Don't." His voice was gentle but firm. "I was intelligence liaison for the Special Operations Command during that time frame. I've seen notebooks like yours before, and I know what they actually contain." Eliza felt the ground shifting beneath her. Not just because her carefully constructed cover was being penetrated, but because she was face to face with someone who understood exactly what that notebook meant, and why she'd never been able to leave it behind. "The operation never existed, sir," she said carefully. "That's what all the paperwork says." "The paperwork says a lot of things." Thornhill moved to the window, looking out at the base where soldiers were going about their evening routines in blissful ignorance of the conversation taking place inside the kitchen. "But I remember the intelligence reports. 3 successful deep-cover infiltrations of insurgent bomb-making networks. Compound formulas that looked like recipes but were actually precise chemical tracking mechanisms. Culinary specialists who weren't just making meals but were secretly documenting explosive manufacturing processes while posing as cooks." He turned back to face her. "You weren't just doing culinary work, Staff Sergeant. You were gathering intelligence on bomb-making operations while under constant surveillance, and you did it so well that most of the people you worked alongside never knew who you really were or what you were really doing." The silence that followed was heavy, with the weight of things that couldn't be said officially but were understood perfectly by both people in the room. Eliza had spent years learning to deflect conversations that moved in this direction, but there was something about Thornhill's tone that made standard deflection feel insufficient. "I did my job, sir," she said finally. "My team did the hard work. Your team wouldn't have had any intelligence to work with if you hadn't risked your life documenting those chemical formulas. We studied those recipe conversions for months afterward. Some people are probably still studying them." Thornhill paused. "You didn't just prepare meals. You documented terrorist bomb-making operations while maintaining your cover as a cook, all while knowing that a single mistake would mean immediate execution." Eliza found herself caught between the instinct to maintain operational security and the strange relief of talking to someone who actually understood what she'd been through. It had been years since she'd spoken to anyone who knew the real story behind her last overseas deployment. "I'm here on routine administrative assignments, sir," she said. "That's all." Thornhill nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he didn't believe the word routine belonged anywhere near her personnel file. "I'm sure that's what the paperwork says, but after what I saw today, the way you handled a complex coordination problem under pressure, the backup planning, the creative problem-solving, I think we're wasting your talents on routine administrative work." Eliza felt a familiar tension building, the kind that came when she sensed her carefully constructed quiet assignment was about to become something more complicated. "Sir, I requested this posting specifically because you wanted to disappear," Thornhill interrupted gently. "I understand that. After what you've been through, after what you've accomplished, the appeal of anonymous routine work makes perfect sense. But sometimes the military has other plans." The conversation was moving in a direction that made Eliza deeply uncomfortable, not because she feared the consequences, but because she'd worked so hard to build a life that didn't require her to be extraordinary every single day. "What kind of other plans, sir?" Thornhill smiled for the first time since he'd entered the kitchen, but it was the kind of smile that suggested he was about to turn someone's world upside down. "We'll discuss that tomorrow, Staff Sergeant. Report to my office at 0800. We're going to talk about putting your skills to use in ways that matter." As he moved toward the door, he paused and looked back at her. "And Morgan, don't worry about Sergeant Rivera or his people. After today's performance, I think their opinions about your qualifications may be subject to revision." The door closed behind him, leaving Eliza alone in the kitchen with the growing realization that her quiet assignment at Fort Mitchell was about to become anything but quiet. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that made everything look washed out and indistinct. Eliza made her way across the base toward the command building, her mind cycling through possible explanations for Colonel Thornhill's summons. In her experience, when senior officers wanted to discuss putting your skills to use in ways that matter, it usually meant the end of whatever peaceful assignment you thought you'd secured. The command building was a study in military efficiency, polished floors, precisely hung photographs of current and former commanders, and a kind of institutional quiet that suggested important decisions were made here on a regular basis. Eliza announced herself to the duty sergeant and was directed to a waiting area outside Thornhill's office. At precisely 0800, the colonel's door opened, and he gestured her inside. His office was larger than she'd expected, with windows overlooking the main parade ground and walls lined with military maps, commendation certificates, and photographs from various deployments. A coffee service was set up on a side table, and 2 chairs were positioned facing each other near the windows rather than across his desk. "Coffee," Thornhill offered, already pouring himself a cup. "Thank you, sir." As they settled into the chairs, Eliza noticed that Thornhill's demeanor was different from the previous evening, less formal, more collaborative, as if the revelation about her background had shifted their relationship from superior-subordinate to something more like professional consultation. "I spent some time last night making phone calls," he began, tracking down people who might remember Operation Crucible, or at least remember the intelligence reports that came out of that region during the time frame we discussed. Eliza kept her expression neutral, but she felt the familiar tension that came when classified operations became subjects of conversation with people who weren't supposed to know they'd existed. "It's remarkable how many people remember intelligence miracles but can't quite recall who was responsible for them," Thornhill continued. "Almost like someone went to considerable trouble to keep certain names out of certain reports. Operational security protocols can be quite thorough, sir." "Yes, they can be, especially when the operations in question weren't supposed to exist in the first place." Thornhill sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "But here's the interesting thing about classified operations. While the details stay buried, the people who were there remember. And some of those people are now in positions where their memories matter." Eliza wasn't sure where this conversation was heading, but she had a growing suspicion that her quiet assignment was about to be officially terminated. "Sir, if there's been some concern about my security clearance or my suitability for this posting." "Quite the opposite." Thornhill sat down his coffee cup and leaned forward slightly. "I've been authorized to offer you a position that would make better use of your actual qualifications." He stood and moved to a wall map that showed the southeastern United States with various military installations marked in different colors. "We're establishing a new multi-service intelligence analysis center. The mission is to streamline chemical threat assessment for joint training exercises, NATO coordination, and counterterrorism operations." Eliza studied the map, noting the complexity of the coordination networks that would be required to manage intelligence across multiple services and allied partners. It was exactly the kind of challenging, high-visibility work she'd been trying to avoid. "It sounds like an important mission, sir, but I'm not sure. The position comes with a promotion to Master Sergeant and assignment as Deputy Director of Operations." Thornhill continued as if she hadn't spoken. "You'd be responsible for developing assessment protocols, training personnel, and managing real-time threat analysis for operations that matter." The offer was generous, probably more generous than anything she'd been offered in years. It was also exactly the kind of responsibility that would put her back in the spotlight, dealing with complex operations where mistakes had serious consequences and success required the kind of intensive coordination that had nearly burned her out during her previous assignment. "Sir, I appreciate the confidence you're showing in my abilities, but I requested assignment to Fort Mitchell specifically because I wanted to step back from high-intensity intelligence work." Thornhill returned to his chair and studied her with the keen attention that suggested he was seeing past her careful diplomatic language to the real concerns underneath. "You're afraid you can't do it anymore," he said quietly. "After what you went through overseas, after the pressure and the constant fear of discovery, and the knowledge that people were depending on you to perform flawlessly, you're worried that you don't have another mission left in you." The accuracy of his assessment was uncomfortable, but Eliza had to acknowledge that he wasn't entirely wrong. Her last deployment had ended with critical intelligence that saved countless lives. But it had also ended with her questioning whether she could maintain that level of performance indefinitely. "It's not a question of capability, sir. It's a question of sustainability." "I understand that, but consider this. What you did overseas was perform under impossible conditions with inadequate resources and no backup support. What I'm offering you is the chance to build systems to prevent those impossible situations from developing in the first place." Thornhill pulled a folder from his desk and handed it to her. "Take a look at the operational parameters. This isn't about sending people undercover into dangerous situations. It's about creating assessment frameworks that make those deployments unnecessary." Eliza opened the folder and found herself looking at organizational charts, mission statements, and operational concepts that represented exactly the kind of systematic approach to intelligence she'd always believed the military needed. Instead of reactive crisis management, the proposed center would focus on predictive analysis and preventive coordination. The goal is to eliminate the kinds of situations where someone has to risk their life to gather intelligence, Thornhill explained. "We want to build systems so robust that extraordinary individual performance becomes unnecessary rather than essential." It was an appealing vision, but Eliza had enough experience to know that even the best systems required people capable of extraordinary performance when unexpected situations arose. And if the systems fail, if unexpected situations develop despite all the planning and coordination, then we need people who know how to perform under pressure, Thornhill replied. "But the difference is that they'll have proper resources, adequate support, and backup systems that make the missions achievable rather than desperate." Eliza studied the organizational charts more carefully, noting the emphasis on cross-service coordination and the integration of allied partners. It was ambitious, complex, and exactly the kind of challenge that would have excited her before her last deployment had taught her the personal costs of accepting such challenges. "When would you need an answer, sir?" "Take the weekend, think it over, discuss it with anyone you trust, and let me know Monday morning." Thornhill paused. "But while you're thinking, consider this. Yesterday you took a deliberately sabotaged assignment and turned it into a successful coordination exercise. You did it under pressure with inadequate resources and while dealing with people who were actively working against your success." Eliza looked up from the folder, startled by his blunt assessment of what had happened with the ingredient delivery. "You knew the assignment was sabotaged?" "I suspected it from the beginning. When a staff sergeant with your background gets assigned to routine kitchen work and immediately gets handed a complex coordination challenge with unrealistic timelines, it raises questions." Thornhill's expression was grim. "What I didn't know was whether you'd rise to the challenge or allow yourself to be defeated by it." The revelation that her test had been a test changed everything about how Eliza understood the past few days. The ingredient problems, the tight timeline, even Rivera's attitude, all of it had been orchestrated to see how she'd respond under pressure. "Why?" she asked. "Because we needed to know if the person behind Operation Crucible was still capable of performing at that level, or if we were dealing with someone who'd been broken by their experiences and was just going through the motions." Eliza felt a flash of anger at being manipulated, but it was tempered by understanding of the military's need to assess personnel capabilities before assigning critical responsibilities. "In your assessment, yesterday you demonstrated that you're not just capable of performing at that level. You're capable of performing at that level while maintaining professional composure under deliberate sabotage." Thornhill smiled. "That's not someone who's been broken by their experiences. That's someone who's been strengthened by them." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Thornhill's aide entered with a message that required immediate attention, providing Eliza with a natural opportunity to take her leave. As she prepared to go, Thornhill handed her a business card with contact information for several people she could call if she wanted to discuss the position with personnel who'd worked similar assignments. "The offer is real, Morgan, and the mission matters. But more importantly, you matter. Don't let fear of past struggles prevent you from accepting future opportunities." Eliza walked back across the base toward the kitchen with her mind churning through implications and possibilities. The position Thornhill had offered represented everything she'd once wanted from her military career: significant responsibility, important work, and the opportunity to build systems that would prevent other people from facing the impossible situations she'd survived. But it also represented everything she'd been trying to escape: high pressure, complex coordination, and the constant weight of knowing that other people's lives depended on her ability to perform consistently at an extraordinary level. As she approached the kitchen, she could see Rivera through the window, apparently briefing Wilson and Brooks on some new assignment. For a moment, she considered what it would mean to stay, to continue working in an environment where her competence was questioned and her contributions were minimized. The notebook felt heavier in her pocket as she reached for the door handle, and she found herself thinking about the people whose lives had been saved by the intelligence she'd gathered. They'd never know her name or what she'd risked to protect them. That wasn't why she'd done it. She'd faced impossible situations with courage and competence, not because she was seeking recognition or advancement, but because the mission required it, and she was the person capable of getting it done. Maybe the question wasn't whether she could handle another high-pressure assignment. Maybe the question was whether she could live with herself if she turned down the opportunity to build systems that would prevent other people from facing the impossible situations she'd survived. The door to the kitchen opened, and Eliza stepped inside to face whatever the rest of her assignment at Fort Mitchell would bring. Monday morning brought unseasonably warm weather and the kind of clear skies that made everything look possible. Eliza arrived at the kitchen to find an atmosphere that was noticeably different from the previous week. Rivera was at his station as usual, but his demeanor had shifted from casual hostility to something more cautious. Wilson and Brooks were present, but subdued, their earlier swagger replaced by an uncertainty that suggested they'd heard rumors about Friday's meeting with Colonel Thornhill. Eliza had spent the weekend thinking about the position offer, making phone calls to the references Thornhill had provided, and ultimately reaching a decision that surprised even her. But first, she had some unfinished business to handle with her current assignment. "Good morning, Sergeant," she said as she settled at her station. "I understand there were some questions about Friday's ingredient delivery." Rivera looked up from his paperwork with an expression that was carefully neutral. The colonel seemed satisfied with the coordination. Everything went smoothly from his perspective. "I'm glad to hear that, but I'm more interested in discussing the coordination from our perspective." Eliza opened her notebook and pulled up the files she'd been working on over the weekend, specifically the series of problems that developed during the sourcing and delivery process. Wilson glanced up from his inventory sheets, and Brooks paused in his preparation. Martinez continued working, but Eliza could see her listening carefully to the conversation. "Problems develop in complex culinary operations," Rivera said. "That's why we plan for contingencies." "Absolutely. But some problems develop because of inadequate planning, and others develop because of deliberate sabotage." Eliza's tone was conversational, but there was an edge underneath that made it clear this wasn't a casual discussion. "I've been reviewing the timeline of issues we encountered, and I've identified some interesting patterns." She turned her notebook toward Rivera, displaying a detailed timeline that mapped ingredient problems against decision points and information availability. For example, the dietary certification issue that Corporal Wilson discovered on Wednesday. According to the specification timestamps, those certification requirements were available in our system on Monday when we started planning, but they weren't flagged as potential problems until Wednesday afternoon, after I'd already committed to suppliers who couldn't meet the corrected specifications. Wilson's face had gone pale, but he kept his voice steady. "Sometimes technical details get overlooked in the initial review process." "Sometimes they do," Eliza agreed. "But in this case, the specifications were accessed through our system on Tuesday morning and again on Tuesday afternoon. Someone reviewed them carefully before the certification issues were raised." She flipped to the next page showing access logs for the databases they'd used during the planning process, similarly the field ration condition issues. The supplier's inventory system clearly indicated moisture exposure rather than perfect condition status, but that information wasn't communicated until after delivery had been arranged. According to the system logs, someone accessed the supplier's detailed inventory descriptions on Monday evening and again on Tuesday morning. Rivera was studying the notebook with the expression of someone who'd been presented with evidence he couldn't easily dispute. System access doesn't necessarily indicate deliberate concealment of information. No, it doesn't. But when you combine the access patterns with the timing of problem identification and the consistent pattern of issues being raised after commitments had been made rather than during initial planning, it suggests coordination rather than coincidence. Eliza closed her notebook and leaned back in her chair. "The question is whether this coordination represents a systemic failure in our planning processes or whether it represents deliberate sabotage designed to create problems that would make the assignment appear more difficult than it actually was." The kitchen had gone completely quiet. Martinez had stopped even pretending to work and was watching the confrontation with open fascination. Brooks looked like he wanted to disappear into his food prep, and Wilson appeared to be weighing his options for response. "That's a serious accusation," Rivera said finally. "It's not an accusation. It's an analysis of available data." Eliza's tone remained professional, but there was steel underneath. "If there are systemic problems with our planning processes, we need to identify and correct them. If there are personnel issues affecting coordination effectiveness, we need to address those as well." Rivera stood and moved to the window, looking out at the base where Monday morning activities were proceeding with normal military efficiency. When he turned back, his expression had shifted from defensive to something more resigned. "What do you want, Morgan?" "I want to understand what happened and why it happened. More importantly, I want to make sure it doesn't happen again." Eliza glanced around the kitchen at the assembled personnel. "Because if we can't coordinate a simple ingredient delivery without sabotage and deliberate obstruction, how can we handle truly complex operations when they develop?" Wilson finally spoke up, his voice quieter than anyone had heard it since Eliza arrived. "Maybe the problem was that we made assumptions about your capabilities based on limited information." "What kind of assumptions?" "That you were here because you couldn't handle more demanding assignments. That culinary coordination was something you were learning, rather than something you'd mastered years ago." Wilson paused. "That notebook was just recipes, rather than something you'd earned in places where earning it mattered." The acknowledgement was grudging, but genuine, and it represented more honesty than Eliza had expected from someone who'd spent the previous week undermining her work. "Those assumptions led to decisions about how to handle your first major assignment," Rivera added. "Decisions that were probably unfair and definitely counterproductive." "Why?" Eliza asked. "What was the point of creating problems that served no useful purpose?" Brooks found his voice for the first time in the conversation. "Testing, I guess. Seeing if you could handle pressure or if you'd fold under complications. And if I'd folded..." Quote, "The silence that followed was answer enough. If she'd failed to coordinate the ingredient delivery successfully, it would have been recorded as evidence that her assignment to routine culinary work was appropriate, and that her previous experience hadn't prepared her for current responsibilities." Martinez spoke up from her station across the room. "It wasn't just about testing. It was about establishing that the existing personnel knew the systems better than someone coming in from outside. Territorial protection." "Something like that," Eliza summarized. Eliza considered the explanations she'd been given, weighing them against her own observations about kitchen dynamics and personnel relationships. The testing theory made sense, but it didn't explain the personal edge that had characterized some of the interactions. "There's something else," she said. "Something about the notebook specifically that seems to have triggered more reaction than simple territorial concerns would justify." Rivera returned to his station and sat down heavily. "You want the whole truth?" "I prefer it. We get a lot of people through here who've had overseas assignments. Most of them spend their time telling stories about what they did and who they worked with, and how important their missions were." Rivera paused. "You came in here clutching a notebook that looked special but wasn't anything we recognized, and you wouldn't explain what it was or where it came from. So you assumed I was trying to appear more important than I actually was." "Something like that. And when you started handling complex coordination like it was routine, it raised questions about whether our assumptions were wrong. Questions that could have been answered by simply asking rather than by creating unnecessary problems." "Yeah," Rivera admitted. "They could have been." Eliza looked around the kitchen at the four people who'd made her first week at Fort Mitchell unnecessarily difficult. She could see genuine regret in some faces, defensive uncertainty in others, and a general recognition that the situation had escalated beyond what anyone had originally intended. "Here's what's going to happen going forward," she said. "We're going to operate as a professional culinary team. That means no more testing, no more territorial games, and no more assumptions about anyone's capabilities based on their appearance or their willingness to discuss their background." She stood and moved to the map of the base that covered most of one wall. "It also means that we're going to start handling the kind of complex operations that this facility is supposed to support. Real coordination, real planning, real problem-solving that serves actual mission requirements rather than personal agendas. "What kind of operations?" Martinez asked. Eliza smiled for the first time since the conversation had started. "The kind that matter. The kind that require everyone in this room to perform at their best, rather than wasting energy on kitchen politics and personality conflicts." Rivera looked up from his station with an expression that suggested he was beginning to understand that the conversation wasn't just about resolving past problems, but about preparing for future challenges. "Are you saying you're staying?" "I'm saying that as of this morning, I've accepted a new assignment that will require significant coordination with this kitchen. Deputy Director of Operations for the new Multi-Service Intelligence Analysis Center." The announcement hit the room like a small explosion. Wilson's mouth fell open. Brooks dropped his spatula, and even Martinez looked startled by the revelation. "You're not leaving?" Brooks asked. "I'm not leaving. I'm expanding." Eliza turned back to face the room. "The question is whether this kitchen is ready to support the kind of operations that the new center will be coordinating, or whether personnel changes will be necessary to ensure adequate professional standards." It was a polite way of asking whether they were prepared to work with her as a colleague and supervisor, or whether they preferred to continue the kind of behavior that had characterized her first week. Rivera stood and extended his hand. "Congratulations on the promotion, Master Sergeant. We look forward to supporting your operations." The handshake was firm and genuine, representing a recognition that the dynamics in the kitchen had fundamentally changed. Wilson and Brooks offered their own congratulations, somewhat awkwardly but with apparent sincerity. Martinez smiled broadly. "I had a feeling the notebook meant something more than recipes." As the morning progressed and the kitchen settled into what felt like a new normal, Eliza reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed in just a few days. She'd come to Fort Mitchell looking for a quiet assignment where she could avoid attention and responsibility. Instead, she'd found herself accepting one of the most challenging positions of her career. But as she watched her colleagues, former antagonists turned potential allies, begin planning for operations that would test all of their capabilities, she realized that sometimes the assignments you think you don't want turn out to be exactly what you need. The notebook weighed in her pocket as she leaned over the planning maps, and for the first time in years, she felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. 3 months later, Master Sergeant Eliza Morgan stood in the newly constructed analysis center, watching as personnel from 4 different services worked together to manage a complex counterterrorism exercise. Banks of monitors displayed real-time chemical composition data from simulations spanning 3 states, and the air hummed with the controlled energy of an operation running exactly as planned. Rivera approached with a tablet displaying the simulation results. "Final numbers from the NATO exercise," he reported. "All threat assessments delivered on schedule. All chemical composition analyses completed without errors, and all participating units report full operational readiness throughout the exercise period." Eliza nodded as she reviewed the data. The numbers represented more than successful threat assessment. They represented a fundamental transformation in how complex operations were planned and executed. Instead of crisis management and last-minute problem-solving, they'd achieved the kind of predictive coordination that made emergencies unnecessary. Any significant issues? Minor calibration glitch with the French detection equipment, but Corporal Wilson identified it during the pre-exercise systems check and had it resolved before operations began. Wilson had proven to be exceptionally capable once his energy was directed toward problem-solving rather than problem creation. His attention to detail and technical expertise made him invaluable for the kind of preventative coordination that the center specialized in. Martinez appeared at Eliza's shoulder with another status report. Personnel rotation for next month's exercises is confirmed. All participating units have been briefed on detection protocols, and backup systems have been tested and verified. Martinez had accepted promotion to Intelligence Coordination Specialist and had become Eliza's most trusted assistant for managing the complex scheduling that kept multiple operations running smoothly. Her organizational skills and diplomatic approach made her perfect for handling the inter-service coordination that could make or break joint operations. Even Brooks had found his niche, developing an unexpected talent for chemical analysis and preparation that ensured detection systems never failed during training scenarios. His enthusiasm for detailed work made him ideal for the kind of thorough preparation that prevented problems before they developed. Colonel Thornhill entered the analysis center with the kind of satisfied expression that suggested he'd been reviewing positive reports about their operations. "Master Sergeant, do you have a few minutes for a briefing?" They walked to Eliza's office, a space that reflected the systematic approach she brought to everything she managed. Maps covered the walls, but these weren't just geographic references. They were operational networks showing the complex relationships between facilities, units, and capabilities that made large-scale coordination possible. "I've been getting calls from senior leadership at 4 different commands," Thornhill began as they settled into chairs facing the operations display. "Everyone wants to know how we've managed to eliminate the kinds of detection failures that used to plague joint exercises." "Systematic planning and preventative problem-solving," Eliza replied. "Instead of waiting for problems to develop and then responding to them, we identify potential issues during the planning phase and build solutions into the operational framework." "I understand the theory. What I'm curious about is the execution. How do you get personnel from different services, different countries, and different operational cultures to work together so smoothly?" Eliza considered the question, thinking about the transformation she'd witnessed in her own kitchen and the similar changes she'd seen throughout the analysis center. "You start by treating everyone as professionals who want to do excellent work," she said. "Most coordination problems aren't caused by incompetence or lack of effort. They're caused by territorial thinking, inadequate communication, and the assumption that conflict is inevitable when different groups work together. And when those assumptions prove incorrect, people generally rise to meet the expectations you set for them. If you expect professional excellence and provide the systems to support it, most personnel will deliver professional excellence." Thornhill nodded thoughtfully. "Speaking of expectations, I've received authorization to expand the center's mission scope. We're being asked to coordinate intelligence for homeland security operations and emergency response exercises." The expansion represented exactly the kind of challenge that would have intimidated Eliza 6 months earlier. Homeland security operations required the same systematic planning as military exercises, but with the added complexity of working with civilian agencies and law enforcement organizations that operated under completely different procedures and priorities. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" "Implementation begins next month. Full operational capability within 6 months." Eliza felt the familiar flutter of excitement that came with accepting new challenges. But it was tempered now by the confidence that came from having built systems robust enough to handle expansion. "We'll need additional personnel and expanded coordination capabilities," she said. "But the framework we've developed should adapt well to homeland security operations." "I was hoping you'd say that," Thornhill smiled, "because I've also received authorization to offer you a permanent promotion to Sergeant Major and assignment as Director of the Center." The offer represented the culmination of everything Eliza had worked toward throughout her military career: significant responsibility, important work, and the opportunity to build something that would continue serving long after she retired. But more importantly, it represented validation that her decision to accept challenge rather than retreat had been correct. "I accept, sir." As they shook hands, Eliza caught sight of her reflection in the office window. The notebook was still in her pocket, but it no longer felt like a weight she carried. Instead, it felt like a reminder of what was possible when competence met opportunity and courage met the chance to make a difference. Later that afternoon, Eliza walked through the analysis center as the day shift prepared to hand operations over to the evening team. The transition was smooth and professional, with detailed briefings and systematic status updates that ensured nothing important would be overlooked during the shift change. Rivera stopped by her office as she was preparing to leave for the day. "Master Sergeant, I wanted to thank you for giving us the chance to prove we could do better. You didn't need to prove anything to me, Tony. You just needed to stop proving things to yourselves and start focusing on the mission. Either way, this assignment has been better than anything I expected when you first arrived." Eliza gathered her things and prepared to head home, but she paused at the operations display that showed the current status of coordination activities across the region. Green indicators showed successful operations, yellow indicated routine monitoring requirements, and the absence of any red warnings confirmed that their preventative approach was working exactly as designed. 6 months ago, she'd been looking for an assignment that would let her disappear, that would allow her to contribute without standing out and serve without taking risks. Instead, she'd found herself in charge of one of the most visible and important intelligence operations in her region of responsibility. But as she looked around the analysis center at the personnel who'd become not just colleagues, but partners in building something significant, she realized that trying to disappear had never been a realistic option. The notebook in her pocket represented capabilities that were too valuable to waste and experiences that were too important to ignore. The drive home took her past the original kitchen where her assignment at Fort Mitchell had begun. Through the window, she could see the evening shift handling routine meal preparation with the same systematic approach that had transformed their operations from reactive crisis management to preventative problem prevention. Wilson was at his station reviewing nutritional specifications with the thoroughness that had once been directed toward finding problems in her work but was now focused on preventing problems in upcoming operations. Martinez was coordinating with off-base facilities, her diplomatic skills ensuring the complex arrangements proceeded smoothly. Brooks was preparing specialized meal components with the attention to detail that guaranteed nothing would fail when it was needed most. They'd all grown into roles that utilized their best capabilities, while minimizing their potential weaknesses. More importantly, they'd learned to work as a team that supported individual excellence rather than demanding individual submission to group mediocrity. As Eliza pulled into her driveway, she reflected on the transformation that had occurred, not just in her professional assignment, but in her understanding of what she wanted from the remainder of her military career. She'd spent so much energy trying to avoid responsibility that she'd forgotten how much satisfaction came from accepting it and using it well. The notebook felt different as she unlocked her front door, and she found herself thinking about the other people who'd worked on Operation Crucible, in situations where accepting responsibility had been a matter of survival rather than career advancement. They'd faced impossible challenges, not because they sought recognition, but because the mission required it, and they were the people capable of getting it done. Maybe that was the real lesson from Operation Crucible and the events that had followed. Not that extraordinary performance was unsustainable, but that it became sustainable when it was supported by adequate resources, competent colleagues, and systems designed to make success achievable rather than miraculous. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Martinez. Emergency analysis request from Fort Bragg. Nothing critical, just complex. Want me to handle it or wait for tomorrow? Eliza smiled as she typed her response. Handle it. You've got this. It was a small moment, but it represented everything she'd learned about leadership, trust, and the difference between carrying responsibility alone and sharing it with people capable of carrying their fair share. The notebook rested on her table as she prepared for bed, no longer feeling like a secret she had to protect or a burden she had to carry. Instead, it felt like a reminder of what was possible when competence met opportunity, when courage met challenge, and when the right people found themselves in positions where their capabilities could make a difference. Tomorrow would bring new coordination challenges, new opportunities to build systems that prevented crises rather than just responding to them, and new chances to prove that the most effective operations were those where extraordinary individual performance became unnecessary, because extraordinary systematic performance made it redundant. But tonight, Master Sergeant Eliza Morgan could rest with the satisfaction of knowing that her quiet assignment had become exactly what she needed it to be, not an escape from responsibility, but a platform for accepting it in ways that honored both her past achievements and her future potential. The notebook caught the moonlight one final time as she settled into sleep, carrying with it the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned that the best way to honor extraordinary experiences was not to hide from them, but to use them as the foundation for building something even better. Sometimes the people who seem most ordinary are the ones with the most extraordinary stories. Sometimes the quiet person in the corner is the one who's already faced the impossible and made it possible. And sometimes the best way to honor past achievements is not to rest on them but to use them as stepping stones toward even greater accomplishments. Eliza Morgan's notebook represented more than just a classified operation that officially never existed. It represented the understanding that true strength comes not from avoiding challenges but from building the systems and relationships that make challenging things achievable. Her story reminds us that respect should be earned through performance rather than demanded through position, that competence speaks louder than credentials, and that the most effective leaders are often those who've learned that the best way to lead is to make leadership unnecessary. In the end, the notebook became not just a symbol of what she'd accomplished in impossible circumstances, but a reminder of what becomes possible when the right person accepts the right responsibility at the right time, supported by the right team, working toward the right goals. Excellence often hides in plain sight, waiting for the moment when ordinary circumstances require extraordinary responses. When that moment comes, the question isn't whether you're capable of rising to meet it. The question is whether you're ready to accept what that capability means for everything that comes after. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.